The hallway on the second floor of Windmill Lane Studios in Dublin smelled like fresh coffee and old carpet, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a recording facility at 11 in the morning when the night session has ended and the day session has not yet begun. It was October 1993, and the building was hosting two separate projects on two separate floors with two separate engineers and two entirely separate ideas about what music was supposed to do. Roger Waters was on the third floor, working on what would become Amused to Death. He had been there for 3 weeks. Kurt Cobain was on the second floor, passing through. Nirvana was between legs of a European tour. They had 2 days in Dublin before the next date in Belfast, and Kurt had arranged, through channels that no longer mattered, to use one of the smaller studios for an afternoon. Not to record anything specific, to work through something that had been sitting in his head for 6 weeks and had not yet resolved itself into a shape he could identify. He arrived at 11:15 carrying a guitar case and a notebook with a broken spiral and nothing else. The receptionist told him that the third floor was occupied by another act and to please keep the volume at a reasonable level until early afternoon. Kurt said he would. He had no intention of keeping the volume at a reasonable level, but he said it anyway. Roger Waters came down the stairs at 11:43. He was looking for a specific brand of mineral water that his engineer had mentioned seeing in the second floor kitchen, and he found it. And he also found Kurt Cobain sitting on the floor of the corridor outside Studio B, back against the wall. Notebook open on his knee, guitar case beside him, writing something in handwriting that was largely illegible from a distance. Roger looked at him for a moment. He knew who Kurt Cobain was. He had seen the covers. He had heard the name more times than he could count over the past 2 years, usually attached to words like generation and voice and movement. The language that gets applied to things before anyone has had enough distance to know whether the language is accurate. He had his own opinions about grunge, which he had expressed in private and semi-private settings with the candor of a man who had never particularly distinguished between private and public when he believed he was correct. "You're the Nirvana person," Roger said. Kurt looked up from the notebook. "Yeah." Roger picked up his mineral water from the kitchen counter, visible through the open door, and came back to stand in the corridor. He looked at the guitar case. He looked at the notebook. "What are you working on?" he asked. The question was not unfriendly. It was the question of someone who considers creative work a serious subject and applies the same scrutiny to everyone, regardless of context. "Something," Kurt said. "I don't know what yet." Roger considered that. "You don't know what you're working on." "Not yet." Roger leaned against the opposite wall. He was not in a hurry. His engineer was recalibrating something upstairs and had told him he had 20 minutes. "That's the problem," Roger said, and his tone was measured and precise. The tone of a man who has thought carefully about things and arrived at conclusions he is willing to defend. "That's the central problem with what your generation is making. The feeling comes first and the thought never arrives. It stays at the level of the feeling, which is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far." Kurt had closed his notebook. He was looking at Roger with an expression that was not hostile and not particularly engaged, and not anything that Roger could easily categorize. "You play the feeling," Roger continued, "and the audience receives the feeling, and for 3 minutes something happens in the room, and then it's over and nothing remains. There's no architecture, no structure that outlasts the immediate emotional transaction. Pink Floyd records are still being listened to 20 years later because there is something underneath the surface that rewards repeated attention. Something that was put there deliberately. You can't put something there deliberately if you don't know what you're working on." He paused. "I'm not saying this to be unkind," he added. "I'm saying it because I think it's true." Kurt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." "Just that." "Okay." Roger waited for more. More did not come. "You disagree?" Roger asked. "I don't know yet," Kurt said. Roger looked at him for another moment, then picked up his mineral water. "Your generation confuses volume with weight," he said. "They're different things." He went back upstairs. The corridor was quiet. Kurt sat on the floor for approximately 90 seconds without moving. Then he picked up his guitar case, stood up, and walked into Studio B. He closed the door behind him. The engineer assigned to Studio B that morning was a 28-year-old named Sharon, who had worked at Windmill Lane for 4 years and had learned in that time to recognize the specific quality of quiet that precedes something worth paying attention to. He had not been told who was coming in. The booking was under a company name. When Kurt walked through the door, Sharon recognized him immediately, said nothing, and began setting up a single microphone in front of a chair in the live room without being asked. Kurt sat down in the chair and took the guitar out of the case. He did not ask about levels. He did not ask about headphones. He did not ask about anything. He played a G chord and listened to it decay in the room. Then he started. What came out in the next 40 minutes did not have a title. It did not have a finished lyric. It had a verse that resolved into a chorus that didn't resolve into anything, that simply stopped at the edge of something and waited there. The melody moved the way certain melodies move, not toward resolution, but toward the sustained exposure of an open question. It circled the same 4 chords with the patience of something that knows it is not going to find what it is looking for, but continues looking anyway, because the looking is the point. Karan sat behind the glass and watched. He had the session recording because he always kept the session recording running. It was standard practice. The tapes from that afternoon would sit in an archive for 11 years before anyone with the authority to do anything about them would know they existed. What Karan remembered years later, when someone finally asked him about that morning, was not the melody, though the melody had stayed with him. It was the silence between takes. Kurt would finish a run through the verse, stop, sit for a moment, and then begin again. Not adjusting the chord shapes, not changing the tempo, working on something that existed below the level of the technical. Sharon had seen a lot of recording sessions. He had seen people working on technique. He had seen people working on arrangement. He had seen very few people working on whatever Kurt Cobain was working on in Studio B that morning. Whatever it was, it did not have a name that Kieran knew. Roger Waters came back downstairs at 1:15. His engineer had gone to lunch. Roger had the third floor to himself and had realized, somewhere in the middle of reviewing a string arrangement, that he was thinking about the conversation in the corridor. This was unusual. Roger Waters did not typically revisit conversations once they were finished. He said what he thought clearly and completely, and then he moved on. But the kid's response had been strange. I don't know yet, not defensive, not dismissive, not particularly engaged. Just that, an honest statement of an intermediate condition. I don't know yet. Roger stood in the second-floor kitchen and listened. From behind the closed door of Studio B, very faintly through the soundproofing in the walls, something was coming through. Not clearly, just the outline of it. A melodic shape that arrived and departed and arrived again, slightly different each time. Like a question being asked in multiple languages to see which one produces the right answer. Roger stood in the kitchen for longer than he had intended. He was not sure what he was listening for. He was not sure he was listening for anything. He was just standing there with his mineral water, and the thing behind the door was doing what it was doing. And Roger Waters, who had spent 30 years thinking carefully about the architecture of music, about the deliberate construction of emotional and intellectual experience, was finding it difficult to locate the flaw he had been certain was there. The melody from behind the door, in fragments, through 2 layers of soundproofing, was not doing what he had expected. It was not staying at the level of the feeling. It was doing something else that he could not yet identify from here. And he was not ready to open the door and get closer. And he was not ready to go back upstairs. And he stood in the kitchen of Windmill Lane Studios for 11 minutes until Kieran came back from lunch, saw him standing there, and said nothing. Roger set down the mineral water and went back upstairs. He did not speak to Kurt Cobain again that day. The session in Studio B ended at 2:45 p.m. Kurt packed the guitar into the case, thanked Sharon, and left. He did not ask about the tape. He did not seem to think about the tape. He walked out through the front door of Windmill Lane with the broken spiral notebook under his arm and the guitar case in his hand, and the expression of someone who has not finished something but has gotten somewhere. Sharon sat in the control room for a moment after he left. On the desk in front of him, the tape reels held 40 minutes of something that did not have a title and did not have a finished lyric and had not been requested by anyone and would not be released in any form Kurt Cobain was alive to approve. Siren labeled the tape with the date and the studio number and put it in the archive. He did not think about it again for a long time. In 2005, Roger Waters gave an interview to a journalist who was writing a long piece about the evolution of progressive rock. The conversation had been going for 2 hours and had covered many things when the journalist, somewhat unexpectedly, asked about grunge. Roger was quiet for a moment. "I said something once," he said, "to Kurt Cobain specifically, about music requiring thought, about grunge staying at the level of feeling without building anything beneath it." The journalist waited. "I believe I said that volume and weight are different things." Another pause. "I was in the same building as him that day. I stood outside a room and heard, through the walls, what he was working on." Roger looked at the table between them. "I had made a categorical statement about an entire body of work based on what I thought I understood about it. And then I stood in a corridor and heard something through 2 layers of soundproofing that complicated the category." "What did you hear?" the journalist asked. Roger considered the question carefully in the way he considered most things. "I heard someone working," he said finally, "not performing, not generating feeling for an audience, working, alone, on something he hadn't finished yet." He paused. "That's not what I said he was doing. That's not the portrait I had drawn of what his music was." The journalist asked if he had ever told Kurt that. "No," Roger said. "I went back upstairs. I had a session to finish. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "You always think there will be another time to say the thing you didn't say? There usually isn't." He looked out the window. "Volume and weight are different things," he said again. "I still believe that, but I was wrong to assume I knew which one he was working with. You can't hear that from a corridor. You can't hear that from an interview or a record or a magazine cover. You have to be in the room. I wasn't in the room." The tape from Studio B that afternoon exists in a private archive. It has been heard by a small number of people. None of them have described it publicly in any detail, which is either a function of legal agreements or personal discretion or both. What is known is that the melody from that session shares certain structural qualities with material that appeared on In Utero, which was released 2 months after that October afternoon in Dublin. Whether the connection is direct or incidental is a question that has no clean answer. What is also known is this: Roger Waters completed Amused to Death in 1992. It is a record about the numbing of human feeling through mass media, about the distance between experience and the representation of experience, about the cost of watching rather than being present. Kurt Cobain never made a record about any of those things. He made records that were those things from the inside, without the architecture and without the distance and without the deliberate construction that Roger had spent his life perfecting. Whether that is a lesser achievement or a different kind of achievement entirely is a question that depends entirely on what you believe music is for. Roger Waters has not answered that question publicly. He answered part of it in a kitchen in Dublin in October 1993, standing with a bottle of mineral water, listening through 2 layers of soundproofing to something he had already decided he understood. He stood there for 11 minutes. He went back upstairs. He has not said, in any interview since, that he was right about what he told Kurt Cobain in that corridor. That silence for Roger Waters is not a small thing. The corridor on the 2nd floor of Windmill Lane Studios is the same corridor it has always been. The carpet is different. The kitchen has been renovated. Studio B is still Studio B. The folding chair where Kurt Cobain sat for 40 minutes is gone, replaced sometime in the late 90s. The tape is in an archive. The mineral water bottle was thrown away the same afternoon. None of these things remember what happened between them. Only the people do, and there are fewer of them now than there were. And the ones who remain are getting to the age where the things they didn't say are heavier than the things they did. Roger Waters is still making music. He still believes that volume and weight are different things. He has never said publicly which one he heard through the door.